For weeks, the small village of St. Mary Mead had hummed with anticipation for the annual production of the Amateur Dramatic Society. It was the sort of event that drew in every villager, whether they adored the theatre or not. There were those who came for the spectacle, those who came to support friends and relatives, and a great many who came simply to see who was sitting with whom and to speculate endlessly afterward about the meaning of it. The Society's chosen play that spring was The Belle of Brighton Pier, a light romantic comedy that promised an evening of glamour, intrigue, and seaside frolic. Hand-painted posters, a little uneven in lettering but charming nonetheless, had been tacked to the notice board outside the grocer's, pasted in the post office window, and even tied to the wrought iron gates of the churchyard. The most talked-about element of the production, however, was not the story itself, but the staging. This year, thanks to the distant cousin of one of the cast members who worked in a West End theatre, they had been loaned a genuine silver curtain, shimmering, luxurious, and entirely unlike anything the modest village hall had ever seen. On the evening of the performance, the air outside was cool and damp, carrying the smell of fresh-cut grass from the vicarage garden. Inside, the church hall had been transformed with surprising effect. The scent of newly applied paint mingled with that of beeswax polish on the wooden floor. A scattering of lilies, provided by Mrs. Chiswell, the vicar's wife, added a faint sweetness to the air. Rows of wooden chairs, some borrowed from the Women's Institute, had been lined up before the small stage. Miss Jane Marple took her seat in the front row, not because she required a good view. Her eyesight, though not what it once had been, was still sharp enough, but because she found front-row seats most useful for observing people's entrances, expressions, and the subtle exchanges that so often passed unnoticed by others. She had no illusions about the perfection of amateur theatricals. They were often well-meant but uneven affairs, with a few truly talented individuals surrounded by others who had been cast either for their enthusiasm or their willingness to pay for materials. Yet Miss Marple had long since learned that such gatherings revealed far more about human nature than they did about the art of acting. And human nature, in her experience, was an endlessly fascinating study. As the first act began, the silver curtain drew back with a rustle and a glimmer, eliciting an audible gasp from a few in the audience. The actors, dressed in their Edwardian seaside finery, delivered their lines with varying degrees of confidence. Polite applause punctuated the dialogue, and somewhere in the back row, someone coughed discreetly into a handkerchief. But Miss Marple's attention wandered from the stage at intervals, drawn to other, quieter dramas unfolding in the hall. Mrs. Beatrice Larkin, the Society's redoubtable treasurer, sat 2 seats down from the aisle, fanning herself in short, brisk motions. Her eyes darted repeatedly toward the stage curtain with a faint, tight-lipped apprehension. In the second row, Roger Felton, a young man of good family but uncertain prospects, sat rigid, avoiding Mrs. Larkin's gaze entirely. Behind them, Mrs. Price Ridley was whispering behind her program to Miss Hartnell, her expression alight with the satisfaction of one who had already decided what she would say about the play over tea tomorrow. Backstage, movements and muffled voices could be heard, though only faintly. Yet as the second act drew near, there was a shift in the atmosphere, a barely perceptible undercurrent of tension. Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime noticing when people were just a little too quick to avoid looking at one another, detected it immediately. From behind the curtain came the hushed sound of an urgent exchange, and she could have sworn she heard the faint scrape of something being dragged across the floor. The highlight of the production was meant to come toward the end of the second act, the grand unveiling of a trunk said to hold stolen jewels. The heroine, played by the pretty and somewhat high-strung Evelyn Mayhew, would open it while standing against the shimmering silver curtain, a tableau that had been rehearsed and fussed over until every Society member knew it by heart. The moment arrived. The stage lights, though modest in strength, threw a warm glow across Evelyn's face as she stepped toward the trunk. The audience leaned forward in anticipation. She bent to undo the clasp. The lid creaked open. What followed was not in the script. Evelyn let out a scream so sharp and sudden that several in the front rows flinched. The sound was raw, not the melodramatic cry of a rehearsed line. She staggered back, clutching the edge of the curtain for support. For an instant, the silver fabric swayed as though unsettled by a draught, its shimmer oddly discordant with the horror that had just entered the scene. Gasps and murmurs swept the hall. The stage manager, pale and wide-eyed, rushed forward but halted abruptly when he saw what lay inside the trunk. The imitation pearls and rhinestones, so carefully arranged during rehearsal, were gone. In their place was the body of a man, half hidden beneath folds of dark damask cloth. His face was ashen, the eyes closed, the features locked in an expression that hovered somewhere between surprise and fear. For a moment, the audience could not decide whether this was an unfortunate attempt at realism or something altogether different. Then Reverend Chiswell rose to his feet, his voice trembling slightly as he called for a calm. A young constable, who had been sitting discreetly near the back, hurried forward, his plain clothes doing little to disguise his official bearing. The play, needless to say, was at an end. Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the stage. Around her, the village was reacting in a dozen small, telling ways. Mrs. Larkin's hands had flown to her pearl necklace, her knuckles white with tension. Roger Felton sat stiff and silent, his jaw tightening. A man in the third row seemed to suppress a faint smile, quickly replaced by an expression of shocked propriety. To most of those present, the scene was one of bewilderment and sudden fear. But to Miss Marple, it was the beginning of another kind of performance, a quieter, more dangerous play that would unfold not under the warm glow of the footlights, but in the cooler and far less forgiving illumination of truth. Somewhere, she thought, behind that gleaming silver curtain, both literally and figuratively, lay the secret that would explain everything. The morning after the disastrous performance, St. Mary Mead awoke beneath a low, colorless sky, as if the weather itself had taken on the mood of the previous night. The usual routines, milk delivered to doorsteps, the postman's bicycle clattering along the lane, shopkeepers raising their shutters, carried on, yet there was a distinct quickening to the way people leaned toward one another, voices lowered but urgent. By 9 o'clock, everyone knew that a man had been found dead inside the trunk on the stage of the church hall. By 9:30, most of the village was discussing who he might have been, who had put him there, and, though this part was spoken in more cautious tones, what secrets the unfortunate fellow might have carried to his grave. Miss Marple took her tea in the sitting-room at her neat little house on the High Street, her knitting on the table beside her. Through the lace curtains, she could see Mrs. Price Ridley hurrying past, her scarf askew, on her way to the grocer's. The woman's gait had that unmistakable forward lean of someone carrying fresh news she was eager to deposit into willing ears. It was only a matter of minutes before the first caller arrived. Miss Hartnell, brisk and direct as always, came knocking under the pretext of returning a gardening book. She stayed just long enough to recount her version of the evening's events, which included several confidently incorrect details, such as the assertion that the man in the trunk was a traveling salesman from Exeter, something Miss Hartnell claimed to have overheard from one of the constables, though no such conversation had occurred in public. Once Miss Hartnell had gone, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind already turning over the more reliable fragments she had gathered the night before. She had taken in not only the expressions on people's faces at the moment of discovery, but also the way certain individuals had moved in the minutes afterward. Hesitations, glances, and the careful positioning of oneself in relation to others. These little things, she knew, often told more than the grand declarations made later. By mid-morning, the vicarage telephone must have been in constant use, for Reverend Chiswell himself appeared at Miss Marple's gate, a little out of breath. He had come, he said, to assure her that the police were quite in control of the matter, and that no one was to become unduly alarmed. That he chose to deliver this reassurance personally told Miss Marple two things at once. That he was, in fact, deeply alarmed, and that the situation had already begun to strain the delicate social fabric of the village. At the post office, Mrs. Larkin was seen speaking in a tight, hurried manner to the postmistress. She clutched her handbag to her chest as though afraid someone might wrest it from her. Roger Felton, usually quick with a nod or a casual greeting, passed by her without acknowledgement, striding off toward the green with his hands thrust deep in his pockets. Evelyn Mayhew, the actress who had opened the trunk, was nowhere to be seen. Her lodgings at Mrs. Partridge's were, according to one neighbour, quiet as the grave, and Mrs. Partridge herself was only opening her door to those she considered absolutely necessary visitors, which did not, apparently, include anyone likely to prolong her boarder's distress. As for the silver curtain, it had been carefully removed from the stage and placed in the custody of Inspector Graves, a man whose slow, deliberate manner concealed a decidedly sharp intelligence. He had arrived from Much Benham late the previous night and was now seen making his way about the village, asking questions in his measured way. Miss Marple knew him slightly. He had been involved in a small matter some years back involving a missing brooch, and she suspected he was not at all fooled by the genteel surface of St. Mary Mead. Still, she also knew that police inspectors often worked with the blunt tools of official inquiry: interviews, evidence, and statements. Human nature, in all its subtler shadings, was not always given the same weight, and in Miss Marple's view, human nature was precisely where this matter would be solved. After luncheon, she took a slow walk toward the church hall, ostensibly to deliver a jar of marmalade to Mrs. Chiswell. The hall door was shut, but through a side window she could see Inspector Graves, speaking with the stage manager, a thin, anxious man named Mr. Lethbridge. Graves was pointing toward the stage and making some note in his book. Mr. Lethbridge's eyes kept straying to the corner where the trunk had been set the night before. Even from a distance, Miss Marple could tell the man was uneasy. She met Mrs. Chiswell in the vicarage kitchen, where the smell of baking bread was strong enough to make one's mouth water. Over tea, Mrs. Chiswell confided that she had hardly slept, replaying the evening's events in her mind. She was certain she had seen someone, though she would not say whom, slip behind the curtain during the interval, when most people were either chatting in the hall or taking the air outside. Miss Marple listened politely, asked a few gentle questions, and left with more than she had brought. The detail of someone moving behind the curtain during the interval was precisely the sort of small, easily forgotten thing that might later prove significant. It was, in her experience, often in those unguarded minutes, when the attention of the majority was elsewhere, that crucial acts were committed. On her way home, she paused at the green, where a small knot of villagers stood in the lee of the oak tree, talking in low tones. The group included Miss Hartnell again, Mrs. Price Ridley, and the blacksmith's wife, each of them contributing a fresh rumor to the already tangled web of half-truths. Someone claimed the dead man had been seen in the company of a stranger earlier in the week. Another insisted he had come to St. Mary Mead expressly to meet a woman, though the identity of this woman shifted with each retelling. Miss Marple offered no opinion, only a mild remark about the unpredictability of life, and moved on. But in her mind, she was arranging and rearranging the facts like a pattern in a patchwork quilt, turning each piece to see how it might fit with the others. She thought again of Mrs. Larkin's nervous glances, of Roger Felton's determined avoidance, of Evelyn Mayhew's absence, and of Mr. Lethbridge's pale, restless eyes. By the time she reached her own gate, the wind had picked up slightly, stirring the daffodils in her front garden. She paused, one hand on the latch, and looked back down the street. From this vantage point, she could see the church tower rising above the rooftops, the post office door swinging open and shut, and the narrow lane leading out toward the old mill. It was, to any casual observer, a perfectly ordinary English village scene. Yet Miss Marple knew that under its surface ran currents as swift and unpredictable as any in the wider world. Somewhere among the villagers, perhaps among those she had known for years, was someone who had placed a man's body inside that trunk, closing the lid on both the man and his secrets. And though no one had yet asked for her assistance, Miss Marple had already begun her quiet investigation. She would listen, she would watch, and she would wait. Because, as she knew better than most, the truth had a way of revealing itself, not through loud proclamations or grand gestures, but in the smallest, most ordinary of things. The following day dawned clear and bright, as if the sun had determined to make a show of banishing the shadows that had settled over St. Mary Mead. Yet in spite of the fine weather, there was a tautness to the air, an unspoken sense that the village was holding its breath. People went about their errands more quickly than usual, conversations stopping abruptly whenever an unfamiliar face passed by. Miss Marple sat in her small breakfast room, the sunlight falling across her neatly laid table. The pot of tea steamed gently, and beside her plate sat a thin slice of toast spread with honey. She read the morning paper without great expectation. Such publications were often late to print anything of local interest, but her eyes lingered on the short column tucked in the corner of page 5. Unidentified man found in village hall during amateur play. The rest was a sparse account, more notable for what it did not say than for what it did. No name, no cause of death, and certainly no mention of the peculiar manner in which the body had been discovered. Folding the paper with care, Miss Marple reflected that anonymity in such cases could be more telling than disclosure. If the man's identity had not yet been released, it was either because the police did not know it, or because they were withholding it. She suspected the latter. By mid-morning, a small commotion outside drew her to the window. A dark green motor car, the sort one might associate with prosperous but not ostentatious city folk, had stopped outside the post office. From it emerged a woman of perhaps 50, well dressed in a traveling coat of fine tweed and a small hat set at a precise angle. She moved with the assured step of someone used to being noticed, yet there was in her manner a certain guardedness. Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime distinguishing between natural reserve and deliberate concealment, thought at once that the latter applied here. The stranger entered the post office, remaining inside for several minutes, and when she emerged, she carried herself with a subtle stiffness, as if she had received news she had both expected and dreaded. It did not take long for the visitor to make her way to the vicarage. Mrs. Chiswell, later that afternoon, was seen on the green, telling Mrs. Price Ridley that the lady's name was Mrs. Elspeth Grant, recently returned from living abroad. According to the vicar's wife, Mrs. Grant had once been a resident of Much Benham and was known in certain circles for her work with charitable societies. Miss Marple noted the phrasing, known in certain circles, which in village speech often meant that someone's reputation was not without its complicated corners. In the early afternoon, Miss Marple set out for a short walk toward the High Street. She met Inspector Graves just outside the grocer's. He greeted her politely, his manner as measured as ever, but she thought she detected in his eyes the faintest flicker of fatigue. Clearly, he had been making inquiries since early that morning. "I take it you've spoken to the principal members of the Dramatic Society," she remarked conversationally. Graves gave a short nod. "They're forthcoming in their way, too forthcoming in some cases. The trouble with an audience of players is that they're trained to project, even when they're lying." "A difficulty," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "though sometimes the most revealing truths come from the smallest of remarks, those made without rehearsal." He glanced at her as if weighing whether to respond further, but chose instead to tip his hat and continue on. Outside the bakery, a new knot of conversation had formed. Roger Felton stood at the edge of it, speaking in low tones to Mr. Lethbridge, the stage manager. Their exchange appeared tense, their eyes flicking toward passers-by. When Miss Marple approached, they broke off, each offering a polite nod before moving in opposite directions. Later, as Miss Marple returned home, she was intercepted by Mrs. Larkin. The treasurer's face was drawn, though her posture remained characteristically upright. She inquired after Miss Marple's health, then, almost as an afterthought, asked whether she had happened to notice anything unusual about the trunk the night of the performance. "Unusual," Miss Marple repeated gently. "Well, only I thought the lock looked tampered with," Mrs. Larkin said quickly before adding, "but I dare say the police will see to all that. It's just such a dreadful business." Her voice trembled slightly at the end, and without waiting for a reply, she excused herself, striding away with her handbag clutched tight. That evening, the tranquility of Miss Marple's sitting room was disturbed by a knock at the door. When she opened it, she found Mrs. Grant standing there, the lines of travel still upon her face. "Forgive the intrusion," Mrs. Grant began, "but I was told you are something of an observer in these parts. I may have known the man found in the trunk." Miss Marple invited her in without hesitation. Over tea, Mrs. Grant spoke with a composure that seemed at times a conscious effort. She said that she had recognized the dead man from the briefest of glimpses, caught when she had managed to speak with Inspector Graves earlier in the day. "He called himself Charles Denning when I knew him," she said slowly, "though whether that was his real name I cannot say. We met in London many years ago. He had connections, the sort one does not always speak of in polite company." Miss Marple listened closely, noting the careful choice of words, and the pauses that suggested more remained unsaid. "Was he a friend?" Mrs. Grant hesitated, her eyes resting on the rim of her teacup. "An acquaintance, but one whose reappearance, especially here, would be difficult to explain to certain people." She would not elaborate further, though Miss Marple sensed she could have had she chosen. When Mrs. Grant took her leave, she did so with the air of someone who had said precisely as much as she intended and no more. Alone once again, Miss Marple considered what she had learned. The man in the trunk was no mere stranger, wandering into the village. His presence and his death were tied to past connections and private histories that were only beginning to surface. And as she set aside her knitting for the night, she reflected that such histories rarely emerged without bringing with them a fresh disturbance, one that might soon ripple through every corner of St. Mary Mead. The next day brought with it a thin veil of cloud that softened the early spring sunlight, casting the village in a muted, almost expectant light. It was the sort of afternoon when St. Mary Mead seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. Yet, beneath the quiet rhythm of postmen on their rounds and shopkeepers sweeping their thresholds, talk of the man in the trunk continued to spread, slipping into conversations over bread at the bakery, across the counters at the post office, and in the hushed pews of the church. Miss Marple, after a modest luncheon of vegetable soup and bread, took her seat by the front window with her knitting. She had already been out that morning for a brief errand and had noticed subtle changes in the village's pattern. Certain people who might ordinarily exchange a few words with one another now avoided meeting, their paths suddenly diverging at the sight of the other. Others seemed unusually eager to linger in company, their voices lowered but quick, eager to pass along some tidbit of supposed fact or half-baked theory. She was not surprised when, a little after 2, Inspector Graves appeared at her gate. His coat was buttoned against the slight chill, his expression as steady as ever, though there was a faint tension about the mouth. She suspected that his progress was being slowed by the very thing that so often hindered official investigations in small villages. A tangle of gossip and truth, bound so tightly together it was hard to tell one from the other. He accepted her offer of tea, though with a brief glance at his watch. Over the clink of china, he inquired whether she had ever seen the man now believed to be Charles Denning in the village prior to the performance. Miss Marple, after a thoughtful pause, said she had not, but she had noted something that might be of interest. Not about the man himself, she said, but about the behavior of those who saw him. People reveal far more in their reactions than they suppose. There was, for example, Mrs. Larkin's repeated glances toward the curtain throughout the evening and Roger Felton's rather determined avoidance of her. That avoidance became more marked after the trunk was opened. Graves listened without interrupting, his gaze steady. He made no immediate note, but Miss Marple suspected her words would be remembered in full later. When he rose to leave, he did so with the slight inclination of the head one gives when a remark has been both understood and appreciated. The afternoon was still young when Miss Marple set out toward the church hall. It was not curiosity alone that drew her there, but the knowledge that places retain traces of events long after the people involved have gone. The hall stood quiet, its doors locked, but the faint scuff of footsteps along the side path drew her attention. There, near the small entrance that led backstage, she encountered Evelyn Mayhew. The young woman was wrapped in a dark coat despite the mild weather, her face pale and drawn. She seemed startled to see Miss Marple, though she quickly attempted a smile. "I was just—" Evelyn began, then faltered. "I had to fetch something I left behind during the performance." Miss Marple's eyes rested on the young woman's hands. They were bare, though faint indentations on her fingers suggested she had recently been wearing gloves for a long period. Evelyn caught her gaze and shifted uncomfortably. "It must be a difficult thing to be at the center of such an unpleasant discovery," Miss Marple said gently. Evelyn let out a breath that was half sigh, half laugh. "It's all anyone can talk about. And every time I close my eyes, I see him lying there. I didn't even know his name." There was truth in that statement, Miss Marple thought, but perhaps not the whole truth. Before she could inquire further, Evelyn excused herself, saying she needed to be somewhere before 3. She departed in the direction of the green, her steps quickening once she reached the road. Continuing her circuit, Miss Marple passed by the post office, where Mrs. Price Ridley was holding court with Miss Hartnell and the blacksmith's wife. The conversation halted abruptly when Miss Marple approached, replaced by polite greetings. She responded in kind, noting the flicker of speculation in their eyes. Her next stop was the vicarage garden, where she found Mrs. Chiswell pruning early roses. The vicar's wife was not one to conceal her thoughts, and she wasted no time in confiding her latest concern. Mrs. Larkin had been to see her that morning, ostensibly to discuss a fundraising event, but had spent most of the visit asking questions about whether anyone else had been backstage during the interval. "It was the strangest thing," Mrs. Chiswell said, setting down her secateurs. "Almost as though she were trying to account for every moment, every movement. And yet she wouldn't say why." Miss Marple listened, storing the detail away. The urge to account for others' actions often masked an unspoken fear of one's own being questioned. As she made her way homeward, the quiet rhythm of the afternoon was broken by the low hum of a motor car approaching from the main road. It slowed as it passed, and Miss Marple recognized the driver. A tall man in a dark suit, his expression hidden behind the brim of his hat. He did not acknowledge her, though she was certain he saw her. The car continued toward the center of the village before turning off in the direction of the old mill road. That evening, word spread quickly that the stranger had visited Mrs. Grant. No one seemed to know the purpose of his call, but the mere fact of it was enough to fuel speculation. Some said he was a solicitor. Others insisted he was a private investigator, and one particularly imaginative suggestion was that he was a stage critic who had been due to review the play. Miss Marple, seated once again in her parlor with her knitting, considered the day's encounters. Evelyn Mayhew's nervousness, Mrs. Larkin's inquiries, and the appearance of the unknown man, all were pieces of a puzzle whose edges she was only beginning to discern. And somewhere, in the midst of it all, was the gleam of that silver curtain, a backdrop to more than just the final act of a village play. She glanced toward the mantel clock. The hour was late, but she knew she would not sleep easily. In her experience, when the past reached into the present, as it seemed to be doing now, it rarely did so without stirring up trouble in its wake. And trouble, once loosed, had a way of drawing in even those who believed themselves quite beyond its reach. The next morning brought a keen breeze from the north, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke from the cottages on the far side of the green. It was the sort of day that seemed to set the village in motion, doors opening for the airing of rooms, shopkeepers standing at thresholds to survey the weather, and a scattering of children darting about with kites that strained against their strings. Yet beneath the hum of ordinary life, the undercurrent of unease persisted. The matter of the man in the trunk was still very much alive in every mind. Miss Marple rose early, her habits never altered by the events around her, and by 8:30 had finished her modest breakfast of porridge and tea. She took a seat by the window, her knitting basket at hand, though the work progressed slowly. Her eyes strayed often to the lane outside, where she noted small but telling movements. Mrs. Larkin hurrying past without her usual exchange of greetings, Roger Felton crossing to the other side upon seeing the Reverend Chiswell, and the postmistress lingering in quiet conversation with Mr. Lethbridge, the stage manager. It was Inspector Graves who broke the morning stillness when he arrived just before 10. His expression, though composed, carried a certain weight. He accepted Miss Marple's offer of tea and sat opposite her, notebook in hand. "I wondered," he began in his deliberate way, "if you might tell me a little more about Mrs. Grant. You saw her recently." Miss Marple nodded. "She called on me the day before yesterday. She spoke of knowing the deceased some years ago, under the name Charles Denning. She did not give much away, but I gathered that his reappearance here was awkward for her." Graves jotted this down, his pen scratching softly against the paper. "We've confirmed. He used that name in London. No fixed address for the past year, but several acquaintances place him in the company of people with dubious dealings." Miss Marple raised her brows slightly. "Dubious dealings have a way of travelling, Inspector, sometimes farther than one might think." He gave her a short, acknowledging look before closing his notebook. "We've also learned that he came to St. Mary Mead the day before the performance. That gives him a short window of contact with the villagers, and yet he appears to have known where to be and when." After he left, Miss Marple reflected on the implications. A man arriving quietly, knowing precisely where to place himself for a confrontation or a meeting, suggested some arrangement had been made in advance. Arrangements of that kind were rarely public knowledge. By midday, word reached her via Mrs. Price Ridley that Evelyn Mayhew had been seen leaving the Old Mill Road in the company of a man described, with a certain relish, as tall, well-dressed, and clearly not from around here. The description matched the stranger Miss Marple had seen driving through the village the previous day. It was enough to prompt a short errand of her own. After making a brief and perfectly reasonable purchase of stamps at the post office, she took the longer route home, passing near the Old Mill Road. The lane was quiet, lined with hawthorn hedges and the occasional gap where fields stretched toward the horizon. At one such gap, she paused, noticing fresh tire tracks in the soft earth by the verge, narrower than those of the usual farm carts, likely from a motor car. The stillness of the lane was broken only by the wind in the hedges, but Miss Marple's mind was turning. The stranger's visit to Mrs. Grant, his later presence on this road, and Evelyn Mayhew's involvement formed a pattern she could not yet name, but the shape of it was beginning to emerge. In the late afternoon, she called at the vicarage under the pretext of delivering a jar of her own plum jam to Mrs. Chiswell. She found the vicar's wife in the drawing-room, mending a pair of gloves. Conversation, as Miss Marple had expected, soon turned to the performance. "There's been the most dreadful talk about poor Evelyn," Mrs. Chiswell said, her voice low. "Some are saying she knew the man in the trunk. I don't believe it, of course, though she's been quite withdrawn since that night." Miss Marple, without offering agreement or denial, remarked that grief and shock could make people act in ways that might be misread by others. Mrs. Chiswell seemed relieved by the suggestion, yet Miss Marple noticed she did not entirely dismiss the rumors either. Upon leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple took the path that skirted the churchyard. There, among the yew trees, she encountered Roger Felton. His hat was pulled low, and he seemed taken aback to see her. "Good afternoon, Mr. Felton," she said pleasantly. He hesitated before returning the greeting. His gaze flickered toward the path behind her, as though expecting someone else to appear. "I was just taking a walk. A fine day for it," she replied, "though one might find the air a little brisk if one lingers." He made a vague sound of agreement and excused himself, striding off with a pace that suggested more urgency than leisure. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind noting his unease as another thread in the growing tapestry. That evening, the last of the daylight fading through her parlor window, Miss Marple sat with her knitting and reviewed what she knew. Charles Denning had arrived in the village with purpose. Mrs. Grant had a past connection to him, one she wished to keep quiet. Evelyn Mayhew had been seen with a stranger who had also visited Mrs. Grant. Mrs. Larkin had shown signs of nervousness before the discovery of the body, and Roger Felton's behavior suggested he too carried knowledge he was unwilling to share. The puzzle was not yet complete, but certain lines were becoming clearer. The man in the trunk had not been the victim of random chance. His presence and his death was the result of choices, plans, and perhaps long-held resentments. Miss Marple knew that in a small village, where lives intertwined over decades, such resentments could be buried deep, hidden under layers of civility and neighborly politeness. But, like roots beneath a garden path, they had a way of pushing upward, breaking through the surface when least expected. She set her knitting aside, listening to the quiet tick of the clock. Somewhere beyond the stillness of the night, the truth was waiting. And Miss Marple, with her patient, unhurried methods, intended to find it before the next move was made. The morning after her quiet reflections brought a pale, washed-out sky over St. Mary Mead. The wind had shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of rain from the west, though the air remained dry. The village seemed, for the moment, subdued. There was less idle gathering outside the shops and fewer lingering conversations at the garden gates. Miss Marple, having lived through other village scandals, recognized this stage well, the moment when talk was less about collecting gossip and more about waiting for the next development to feed it. She decided that the next development would be best sought rather than awaited. After breakfast, she took her hat and light coat and walked toward the church hall. Inspector Graves had left the main entrance locked, but the side door stood open. Inside, the air was cooler, touched with the scent of dust and polish. The stage, stripped of its grand silver curtain, looked smaller and somehow more ordinary. Mr. Lethbridge, the stage manager, was there, busy stacking wooden chairs. His movements were careful, almost methodical, but his eyes darted toward Miss Marple as she entered. "Good morning," she said warmly. "I thought I might return Mrs. Chiswell's cake tin. She told me she left it here after the performance." "Oh, yes, it's in the kitchen, I think." His voice carried a faint strain, as though the presence of any visitor in the hall unsettled him. Miss Marple, rather than heading directly to the kitchen, walked slowly toward the wings, glancing up at the bare curtain rail. It was a striking sight, that silver curtain. Quite transformed the place. Mr. Lethbridge gave a short nod. "Yes. Special loan. We were all very proud of it." His tone was flat, the pride dampened. "Mrs. Chiswell mentioned," Miss Marple said gently, "that during the interval she saw someone slip behind the curtain. A curious thing, since that part of the stage was supposed to be empty until the second act." For a fraction of a second, the man's hand froze on the chair he was folding. Then he gave a forced chuckle. "People wander all over during an interval. Could have been anyone. Actors fussing with props, checking costumes." "Quite so," Miss Marple replied. Though it is unusual, is it not, for a stage door to be opened when a trunk, intended for a later scene, is already set in place? He avoided her eyes and busied himself with stacking the chairs more noisily. She let the matter rest, thanked him for the cake tin, and made her way back into the brisk air. His reaction had told her more than his words. By the time she reached the high street, a light drizzle had begun to fall, sending villagers scurrying for shelter. She stepped into the post office to avoid the worst of it. Inside, Mrs. Larkin was speaking with the postmistress in low, urgent tones. At the sight of Miss Marple, Mrs. Larkin straightened, her polite smile just a shade too quick. "Miss Marple," she said, "I do hope you're keeping well in all this unpleasantness." "Quite well, thank you," Miss Marple answered. "And yourself?" Mrs. Larkin's gloved fingers tapped her handbag. "It's simply dreadful what happened. I only wish the police would make an arrest. It would set everyone's mind at ease." "Arrests can be hasty things," Miss Marple murmured, "and in my experience, the truth is rarely so obliging as to stand in plain sight." Mrs. Larkin colored slightly and made her excuses. As she departed, the postmistress leaned toward Miss Marple and said in a conspiratorial whisper, "She's been in here twice today already. Posting letters, she says, but I've not seen a stamp go on one of them before she tucks it away again." The rain had eased by the time Miss Marple left the post office, but her thoughts were no clearer than the dampened air. Mrs. Larkin's nervousness, Mr. Lethbridge's evasions, and Evelyn Mayhew's recent absence all pointed toward the same hour in the evening of the performance. The interval. That was the window in which something had happened, something that transformed a theater prop into the hiding place for a dead man. In the afternoon, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Grant under the polite pretext of returning a book. The drawing room was tidy, the fire neatly laid but unlit. Mrs. Grant received her with a cool civility. "I hear," Miss Marple began, "that the man found in the trunk may have been in the village the day before the play." Mrs. Grant's gaze sharpened, though her tone remained measured. "Is that so? I can't say I was aware of his movements." Miss Marple nodded. "Of course. But I have been thinking it would have been rather easy for someone to meet him privately. The interval of a performance, for instance, when most people's attention is elsewhere, offers just such an opportunity." Mrs. Grant's lips thinned and she set down her teacup with precision. "I cannot imagine why anyone would wish to meet him at all. He was not the sort of man one invited into one's affairs." There was something in her voice, half disdain, half something else, that told Miss Marple this was not the full truth, yet pressing her would only make her close her shutters more firmly. As Miss Marple walked home through the damp lanes, the pieces of her mental puzzle shifted. The interval stood out now as the fulcrum of the whole business. It was a brief span of time, but enough for secrets to be exchanged, for threats to be made, or for something far more final to occur. And she could not shake the feeling that, somewhere among the polite greetings and careful evasions of her neighbors, someone was carrying the memory of exactly what had taken place in those few decisive minutes. The next morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to a sky of restless gray, the clouds moving quickly as if hurrying toward some undisclosed destination. There was a cool edge to the air that promised rain before the day was out. The village carried on with its usual rhythm, but the quiet glances exchanged across the high street and the half-finished conversations when certain people approached told Miss Marple that the atmosphere had not lightened. If anything, the unease was settling in more firmly, like damp creeping into the walls of an old cottage. Miss Marple had not intended to leave her garden that morning, but shortly after 10 she received a visit from young Tommy Partridge, the butcher's boy. He came puffing up her path, clutching a small brown paper parcel from the grocer, though he admitted it had been his mother who suggested he might deliver it. With the sort of eagerness peculiar to village youth, he could not resist sharing what he had seen earlier. "There was a motor car on the old mill road, Miss Marple," he said, "just standing there. Black saloon with a London plate, and a man standing by it. tall chap, wearing a dark coat and a hat pulled low. It looked like the same one who came through here the other day. Didn't wave, didn't nod, just got in and drove off when he saw me looking. Miss Marple thanked him for his trouble and gave him a sixpence for his errand. She watched him bound away, her thoughts already turning. The stranger's repeated presence on that road was not chance. The old mill itself was long disused, its wheels silent for decades, but the lane was quiet, offering privacy for any meeting one wished to avoid being seen. By 11:30, Miss Marple had set out on one of her constitutionals, choosing a route that would take her near the old mill road. The sky was lower now, the wind carrying the faint scent of rain. When she reached the turnoff, she slowed, pausing as if to admire the hawthorn hedge. The lane ahead was empty, its curves disappearing into the trees. She walked on a little way, the gravel crunching softly beneath her shoes. It was here she noticed something curious. Near the verge, the mud bore fresh tire impressions, more deeply marked on one side, as though the vehicle had braked suddenly. Beside them, a set of footprints led toward a gap in the hedge. Miss Marple peered through and saw a narrow track leading toward the back fields, half overgrown with grass and nettles. She made a mental note and continued on her way, not lingering long enough to appear overly interested should anyone be watching. On her return to the high street, she saw Inspector Graves emerging from the post office. His expression was thoughtful, his manner brisk. When he spotted her, he crossed the road. "I hear you've been walking near the old mill road," he said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One does like to stretch one's legs, and it is a most peaceful route if one overlooks the occasional motor car." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You've seen him then? The man with the black saloon?" "Not today, but I understand he was seen again this morning." Graves glanced toward the green before lowering his voice. "We believe he may have met with one of the villagers in recent days, possibly more than once. And there's reason to think that meeting may be connected to our case." Miss Marple's tone was mild. "Connections have a way of revealing themselves, Inspector. The difficulty is, they rarely do so all at once." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Larkin, who approached with a smile that did not reach her eyes. She greeted them both and began speaking about the weather, but Miss Marple noted the slight tension in her shoulders and the way her gloved hands were clasped tightly together. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Partridge's lodgings under the pretext of returning a handkerchief she claimed to have found after the performance. Evelyn Mayhew was in the small parlor, sitting near the window with a book in her lap, though her eyes were not on the page. She started slightly at Miss Marple's arrival, then offered a faint smile. "How are you, my dear?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Oh, as well as can be expected," Evelyn replied. "I'm trying to keep busy." They spoke for a few minutes about trivial matters before Miss Marple mentioned, as if in passing, that she had heard of the motor car on the old mill road. Evelyn's fingers tightened on her book. "I don't know anything about that," she said quickly, the denial almost too swift. "It's probably nothing to do with all this." Miss Marple's expression was serene. One never knows what may be connected until the pattern emerges. After leaving, Miss Marple paused in the narrow lane behind the lodgings, her mind turning over the exchange. Evelyn's reaction had been unmistakable, an involuntary tightening as if bracing herself against some unspoken knowledge. Later, just as the light was beginning to fade, Miss Marple stood at her garden gate and looked down the high street. The village appeared calm enough. A few late shoppers heading home, the postmistress closing her shutters, and the vicar crossing toward the church. Yet she felt the weight of something moving beneath the surface, the kind of slow undercurrent that eventually reached the shore with force. The stranger had come to the village more than once. Evelyn Mayhew had reason to be uneasy about his presence. Mrs. Larkin's composure seemed to fray whenever the matter drew near. And the old mill road, quiet, secluded, was beginning to look less like a forgotten lane and more like the path to the heart of the matter. Miss Marple knew that, before long, the threads connecting these people and places would have to be drawn together. But for now, she would wait, watch, and listen. For in her experience, even the most careful liar eventually forgot to guard one small detail. And it was in that overlooked detail that the truth so often lay hidden. The following day dawned with a thin, watery sunlight breaking through the clouds, giving the village a deceptively peaceful air. St. Mary Mead, seen from Miss Marple's front window, looked as it always had. Children walking to school, Mrs. Price Ridley sweeping her front step with the air of a woman performing an important civic duty, and the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere beyond the green. Yet beneath that calm picture, Miss Marple could sense the continuing ripple of unease. The events of the past week had not faded. They had settled in like a stubborn stain that no amount of scrubbing could remove. The stranger's repeated appearances on the Old Mill Road had become a subject of quiet speculation. Most residents pretended not to be curious, but Miss Marple knew how closely they were watching. And she knew, too, that people in the village had begun to alter their movements, slightly but noticeably, so as to either avoid or cross paths with certain individuals. After breakfast, she decided to stop at the post office. The air was fresh, and a breeze stirred the daffodils along the lane. When she stepped inside, she found the postmistress sorting letters behind the counter. Her quick glance up and the faint tightening of her lips suggested she had something she was longing to say but had not yet decided if she should. "Busy morning?" Miss Marple asked cheerfully. "Oh, the usual," the postmistress replied, "though I did have a bit of a muddle earlier, a letter without a proper address. Slipped into the outgoing pile it did, but no stamp and no envelope." Miss Marple raised her brows slightly. "No envelope?" The postmistress hesitated. "Well, more like a folded sheet. I only saw the first line when I was trying to work out whose it was. We cannot be seen in the village again, not after—" And then I stopped myself, of course. It's not my place. But I'll tell you this. It was on one of Mrs. Larkin's writing papers. I'd know that monogram anywhere." Miss Marple made no comment, but her mind recorded every detail. A letter half-written and never sent could mean nothing, or it could be the piece of a conversation someone had not dared to hold aloud. She left the post office and walked toward the green, where she found Inspector Graves speaking to the vicar near the church gates. Graves greeted her with a brief nod. "I hear you've been to see our postmistress," he said. "Purely to buy a few stamps," Miss Marple replied mildly, "though one does sometimes hear interesting things in the course of ordinary errands." The inspector's mouth twitched in the faintest suggestion of a smile. "If you happen to hear anything that might be of relevance, I'd appreciate knowing sooner rather than later. This case is delicate." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Delicate matters require careful handling, and sometimes the smallest of slips can be more telling than the grandest of statements." That afternoon, while trimming the spent blooms in her garden, Miss Marple saw Evelyn Mayhew pass along the lane. The young woman's pace was brisk, but her eyes kept flicking over her shoulder. Miss Marple waited until she had gone by, then stepped to her gate and watched her turn in the direction of the Old Mill Road. An hour later, Roger Felton appeared, walking with the air of someone pretending to be casual while having a definite destination. He, too, turned toward the Old Mill Road. Miss Marple's lips pressed into the faintest line. It seemed that the secluded lane was becoming more traveled than anyone cared to admit. Later in the day, Mrs. Larkin herself came calling, a smile fixed in place but not reaching her eyes. She spoke first of the weather, then of a charity committee meeting, and finally, in what she tried to make sound like an afterthought, she asked if Miss Marple had happened to hear whether Inspector Graves had made progress. "Matters of progress," Miss Marple said gently, "are often not for public discussion until they are ready to be concluded." Mrs. Larkin's hand tightened on her handbag. "Well, I hope he comes to some conclusion soon. It's no good having this sort of thing hanging over everyone." As she rose to leave, Miss Marple noticed that a sheet of folded paper had slipped partly out of Mrs. Larkin's bag. A monogram in the corner matched precisely what the postmistress had described. Mrs. Larkin pushed it back in quickly, her cheeks coloring faintly. When evening came, Miss Marple sat in her parlor, knitting untouched on her lap. The day's small observations fitted themselves into her mind like pieces of a quilt. The letter with its unfinished sentence, the repeated visits to the old mill road, and the careful way Mrs. Larkin tried to steer conversation all pointed toward something shared, a secret being managed rather than forgotten. And Miss Marple, who knew better than most how secrets behaved, understood that managed secrets often grew restless. They had a tendency to slip from their keeper's grasp, sometimes in the smallest, most unlooked-for ways. The question was not whether this one would escape into the open, but when and what damage it would do once it did. The rain that had been threatening for several days finally came in the night, a steady, soft patter that washed the dust from the hedgerows and left the morning air smelling faintly of earth and wet leaves. By the time Miss Marple drew back her curtains, the clouds had lightened to a pale silver grey, and the high street wore a fresh, rain-washed look. It was on such mornings that the village seemed, on the surface, entirely innocent. Shopkeepers arranging their displays, children in slickers hurrying to school, and neighbors exchanging remarks about the weather, as though no darker subject had occupied their thoughts for days. Yet Miss Marple knew that the appearance of calm was often the most dangerous stage in any matter. It was the point at which those involved began to feel safe enough to make mistakes. After breakfast, she took her umbrella and set out toward the green, stopping at the bakery for a small loaf. Mrs. Chiswell was there, chatting with the baker's wife, and her face lit with relief when she saw Miss Marple. "My dear, I must speak to you," she began in a low voice. "I saw something yesterday afternoon, quite by accident, that I can't decide whether to tell Inspector Graves." Miss Marple encouraged her with a quiet nod. "I was cutting across the back path by the churchyard," Mrs. Chiswell continued, "and I happened to glance through the hedge toward the old mill road. I saw Mrs. Larkin there. She was speaking with Evelyn Mayhew, and I'm quite sure there was someone else just out of sight, for Evelyn kept turning her head and nodding as though in answer to another person. But when I approached the gap in the hedge, they had gone." Miss Marple thanked her for the information, making a mental note that this was the second time in as many days that Mrs. Larkin and Evelyn had been linked to that secluded lane. Later that morning, she took the long way home, passing the vicarage and following a path that skirted the back gardens of several cottages. At a bend in the path, she nearly collided with Roger Felton, who looked startled to see her. His hat brim was low, and a fine sheen of damp clung to his coat. "Out early," she remarked pleasantly. "Just walking," he said quickly. "Needed some air." Miss Marple smiled. "Fresh air is a fine thing, though some places are breezier than others. Old Mill Road, for instance." He gave a brief laugh, but there was no ease in it, and after a hurried good morning, he strode away in the opposite direction. When she returned home, she found Inspector Graves waiting at her gate. He accepted her invitation to step inside, removing his hat as he did so. "We've confirmed that the man calling himself Charles Denning arrived in the village 2 days before the play," he said without preamble. "But more interesting is that he appears to have met with at least 2 people during that time. I have reason to think one meeting took place in the afternoon before the performance, and another during the interval itself." Miss Marple poured tea and listened as he explained that a farm labourer, returning from Much Benham, had seen a black saloon parked by the old mill road the day before the play. 2 people were standing by it, one of them believed to be a woman in a dark coat. "Mrs. Larkin's coat is dark," Miss Marple said mildly. "So is Evelyn Mayhew's." Graves gave her a measuring look. "You've observed them both often enough, I imagine. Which strikes you as more likely?" Miss Marple's expression was serene. Likelihood is a slippery thing, Inspector. In my experience, the person who appears most likely is often nothing of the kind. But I will say this. Mrs. Larkin has been unusually preoccupied with who might have been backstage during the interval. That suggests a desire to account for movements, hers or someone else's. The inspector sipped his tea without comment, though his eyes were thoughtful. In the late afternoon, Miss Marple took a seat by her front window with her knitting and a clear view of the lane. She saw Evelyn Mayhew pass by, her head lowered, and a few minutes later Mrs. Larkin followed, walking with brisk determination. Neither woman glanced toward the other's house. Just before dusk, the black saloon appeared once more, turning off toward the old mill road. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose to the window, though she made no move to follow. Some meetings revealed more in the return than in the arrival. An hour later, Evelyn came back along the lane, her face pale and drawn. She walked quickly, as though eager to be indoors. Mrs. Larkin returned not long after, but her pace was slower, her gaze fixed ahead, and her mouth set in a tight line. Miss Marple sat down again, her thoughts knitting together far more rapidly than the wool in her lap. A meeting had taken place. Of that she was certain. Who else had been present besides Evelyn and Mrs. Larkin was the question, though she had her suspicions. The stranger with the black saloon was not an idle visitor. His presence in the village, his connection to Charles Denning, and his repeated use of the old mill road suggested he was a link in whatever chain bound these events together. The chain was tightening, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, intended to see exactly where it would pull next. The morning that followed was unusually still for St. Mary Mead. Even the usual chatter of sparrows in the hedgerow outside Miss Marple's cottage seemed subdued, as though the village itself were listening. The rain had washed the streets clean, and a thin sheen of moisture clung to the cobbles in the high street. From her breakfast table, Miss Marple watched a milk cart make its rounds, the driver stopping to exchange a word with each customer before moving on. It was over her second cup of tea that she resolved to call on Mrs. Chiswell again. The vicar's wife, when faced with an air of mystery, was often an unwitting source of useful scraps, snippets of observation tucked in between discussions of parish matters. When Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage, she found Mrs. Chiswell in the sitting-room with her mending basket, a half-darned sock draped over her lap. After a few pleasantries, the conversation took the turn Miss Marple had hoped for. "I've been thinking about what I told you yesterday," Mrs. Chiswell began, "about seeing Mrs. Larkin and Evelyn Mayhew near the old mill road. You know, I didn't notice at the time, but Evelyn had a small parcel in her hand, wrapped in brown paper, no bigger than a book, and when I saw her later that evening, it was gone." Miss Marple made a soft sound of interest. "You are quite certain?" Mrs. Chiswell nodded firmly. "Quite. She's not the sort to carry something like that around unless it was important. She seemed rather protective of it." The image of Evelyn with the parcel lingered in Miss Marple's mind as she walked back toward the high street. Such objects, small, easily concealed but clearly significant to their carrier, often lay at the heart of matters others preferred to leave undisturbed. At the post office, she encountered Roger Felton, who had just stepped out, buttoning his coat against the wind. He greeted her politely, but seemed anxious to be away. Miss Marple, however, slowed him with a remark. "I hear we may be in for more rain before the day is done." Roger glanced up at the sky, then back at her. "Yes, looks that way." His tone was polite but distracted. He shifted his weight as though eager to end the exchange. "By the way," Miss Marple continued lightly, "I saw you speaking to Mr. Lethbridge yesterday afternoon." His eyes flickered before he could mask it. "Oh, yes. Just about the hall. Making sure it's locked up properly now, what with, well, what happened. And did you find it was?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. He's keeping it shut, except for when the inspector needs to look over it." Miss Marple let him go. but her mind dwelt on that brief flicker of unease. It was the reaction of a man who knew more about the hall than he cared to discuss. In the early afternoon, Inspector Graves paid her a visit. He came without his notebook this time, carrying instead a folded sheet of paper which he placed on the table between them. "This was found in the hedgerow near the old mill road," he said. "One of the constables spotted it caught in a branch. Could have been blown there. Could have been dropped. Recognize the monogram?" Miss Marple studied it. "Mrs. Larkins. And I suppose I'm not the only one who has heard of her fondness for that particular stationery." Graves gave a brief nod. "The paper itself isn't much use to us. Whatever was written on it has been smudged nearly away by the rain, but I can make out a few words. Meet, risk, and something that might be tonight." Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at the paper before returning it to him. "The trouble with letters, Inspector, is that they are rather like people. They can say one thing while meaning another, and when they are not meant to be read by just anyone, they often become incomplete." That evening she sat by the fire, the flames casting a warm glow over her parlor. Outside the wind had risen, rattling the bare branches in the garden. She had nearly reached the heel of the sock she was knitting when there came a sharp knock at the door. Evelyn Mayhew stood there, pale and visibly agitated. "Miss Marple, could I speak to you, just for a moment?" Of course she could. Miss Marple ushered her in and settled her into the chair nearest the fire. Evelyn clasped her hands tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the carpet. "I don't know who else to talk to," she began. "I keep thinking about that night, about the interval. I went backstage for just a few minutes. I was looking for Mr. Lethbridge. But instead I saw—" She broke off, swallowing. Miss Marple waited. The silence stretched, filled only by the faint ticking of the clock. "I saw Mrs. Larkin, and she wasn't alone." Evelyn's voice dropped to a whisper. "There was a man with her, tall, in a dark coat. I didn't see his face properly. She was handing him something. It might have been money." Or a letter. Miss Marple did not react outwardly, though inwardly she recognized the shape of a truth she had been circling for days. Evelyn rose quickly. "I shouldn't have said anything. Please don't tell her I came here." After the door closed behind her, Miss Marple sat for some time, her knitting untouched. The pieces were falling into place, but there were still gaps, deliberate gaps, left by those who had chosen silence over explanation. Yet she knew, as surely as she knew the wind would bring rain before morning, that such gaps could not hold forever. One slip, one careless word, would be enough to unpick the whole arrangement. The rain came as Miss Marple had expected. First as a fine drizzle before dawn, and then as a steady, determined fall that blurred the view from her front window. The morning light was slow to arrive, giving the village a muted, watercolor appearance. Roof tiles glistened, the cobbles were slick, and the air held that particular scent of wet earth and wood smoke that always followed a night of wind. By mid-morning, the rain had eased, leaving behind a sheen of dampness on every surface. Miss Marple stepped outside to check the state of her garden and noticed the narrow lane that ran along the side of her cottage. The mud there had taken on a soft, clinging quality, ideal for holding impressions. And there they were, two sets of footprints, one light and narrow, the other heavier, the prints slightly deeper at the toe as though their owner had been walking quickly. She bent slightly, studying them without touching. The lighter prints were most likely a woman's, the heavier a man's. Both sets headed in the direction of the old mill road. The edges of the impressions were still sharp, suggesting they had been made after the heaviest of the night's rain had passed. Miss Marple straightened slowly. Footprints were, in themselves, only signs that someone had passed. But in a place like St. Mary Mead, where everyone knew one another's habits, a change in those habits was far more revealing. After breakfast, she decided to call on Mrs. Price Ridley, who could be counted on to have an opinion about the comings and goings in the village, whether or not it was correct. Mrs. Price Ridley was found in her parlour, pouring tea into a cup decorated with faded roses. "It's a curious thing," she said after a few minutes of pleasantries, "but I've noticed Evelyn Mayhew's been out walking early these past few mornings. Not her usual way at all. Always used to see her heading into the high street mid-morning, but now it's first thing, before most of us have our kettles boiled." Miss Marple made a soft sound of interest. "Perhaps she's taken to enjoying the quiet of the morning." Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "Or perhaps she's taken to enjoying the quiet company of someone who prefers not to be seen." The remark was delivered with a certain relish, but Miss Marple stored it away without comment. Leaving the house, she took the path toward the churchyard. From there she had a partial view of the lane that led to the old mill road. It was here she saw Inspector Graves speaking with a constable, their heads close together against the wind. Graves caught sight of her, and after a brief word to the constable, walked over. "I was going to call on you later," he said. "We found fresh signs near the old mill yesterday evening, tire marks and footprints leading into the field beyond. The field backs onto a line of trees that could provide cover for a meeting. Whoever it was took care to keep to the edge, out of view from the lane." Miss Marple nodded. "And did the footprints suggest more than one person?" "Two sets," he replied. "One lighter, one heavier. Could be a man and a woman." She allowed herself the smallest of smiles. That does seem to be the arrangement of late. They walked a little way together, discussing the difficulty of confirming the stranger's identity. Graves admitted that while they had traced the Black Saloon to a hire service in London, the record stopped short of naming the driver. It had been rented in cash, under a name he suspected was false. In the afternoon, Miss Marple stopped by the vicarage to return a borrowed book. Mrs. Chiswell, upon hearing of the footprints, lowered her voice and confided that she had overheard a curious exchange the day before between Mrs. Larkin and Roger Felton. "They were standing by the church wall, speaking rather urgently," she said. "I didn't hear every word, but I distinctly caught Mrs. Larkin say, 'It has to be tonight, before he leaves.' And then she glanced about in that way people do when they hope no one is listening." Miss Marple thanked her and departed, her mind fitting this remark alongside the footprints and the repeated visits to the old mill road. The idea that he might be the stranger in the saloon was difficult to dismiss. If so, then the night Mrs. Chiswell had overheard them discussing could well have been the night the footprints were made. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her chair by the fire, but her knitting lay untouched. The pattern emerging in her mind was becoming sharper. Mrs. Larkin's concealed correspondence, Evelyn's nervousness, Roger Felton's unease, and now this suggestion of a meeting before he leaves. In her experience, meetings hurriedly arranged and cloaked in secrecy were rarely about trivial matters. And when such meetings involved people who had reason to fear the presence of a man like Charles Denning, they were even less likely to be innocent. The day drew on, the wind rising again as night approached. Miss Marple watched from her window as the street lamps flickered to life and the village settled into its evening quiet. Yet she felt certain that somewhere, away from the light, the next move in this dangerous game was already being made, and that it would not be long before the consequences found their way back to her door. The wind had blown hard through the night, rattling the loose panes of the old cottages and scattering damp leaves along the lanes. When morning came, it brought with it a thin sunlight and a brittle chill that seemed to sharpen the edges of every sound in St. Mary Mead. Church bells carried more distinctly across the green, the clang of the milk pails at the dairy rang clear, and even the gossip in the high street seemed to travel further than usual. Miss Marple, after a breakfast taken with more thought than appetite, sat in her parlour chair and looked over her knitting without really seeing it. The events of the past days, each small, apparently disconnected observation, were beginning to settle into a recognizable order in her mind. The trouble was, It was an order she could not yet name aloud, not until one more piece fell into place. At 9:30, she put on her coat and set out toward the high street. The path took her past the churchyard, where the vicar was speaking to Mrs. Price Ridley. The latter broke off her conversation to give Miss Marple a look that mingled curiosity with a touch of self-importance, as though she herself had been entrusted with some part of the investigation. "Have you heard," Mrs. Price Ridley began, "that Mrs. Larkin has been seen taking the early train to Much Benham these last 2 mornings? Back again before luncheon, mind you. Says it's for shopping, but one has to wonder." Miss Marple's expression was mild. "Indeed, shopping can be a very elastic term." She continued on her way, the remark stored carefully with the others. By the time she reached the post office, the postmistress was at the counter, sorting letters with the brisk efficiency of one who knew exactly which pieces of paper were likely to set the village humming. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said. "You just missed Mrs. Larkin. Came in to post something urgent. Registered letter, London address." Miss Marple accepted her change and stamps without comment, but she was thinking hard. Mrs. Larkin had a habit of guarding her correspondence closely. Sending a registered letter meant she wanted certainty that it would reach its destination, and perhaps that it would leave no doubt she had sent it. Outside, the village was brisk with the sound of errands being run. She crossed to the baker's and found Evelyn Mayhew standing just inside, selecting a loaf. The young woman looked tired, her eyes shadowed, but she attempted a polite smile when she saw Miss Marple. "Not much sleep these past nights?" Miss Marple asked gently. Evelyn's smile wavered. "It's been difficult. Everyone looks at me as though they think I know more than I do." "And do you?" The question was asked so mildly that it might have been mistaken for casual interest. Evelyn hesitated, then shook her head. "Only what I've already told you, that I saw Mrs. Larkin with a man during the interval, but I've been wondering if I should have said anything. It's only made things more complicated." Miss Marple made a soothing remark and let the conversation drift to other matters. There was no advantage in pressing Evelyn further now. What she had to give would come when she was ready, or when events forced her to speak. On her way home, Miss Marple chose the longer route past the edge of the old mill road. She did not expect to see the Black Saloon again, but the habit of looking had become second nature. The lane was empty, yet the verge bore fresh marks. Not just tire tracks, but the scuffed impressions of more than one person having stood there. A cigarette end lay in the mud, the paper softened by damp. Someone had been waiting there recently, and not for long. In the early afternoon, Inspector Graves arrived. His manner was as deliberate as ever, but there was a watchfulness in his eyes that suggested some new piece of information had come his way. "We've had a development," he said, accepting a cup of tea. "A witness came forward this morning, a delivery driver passing through Much Benham late last week. He says he saw our Black Saloon in the yard of an old storage building just outside the village, and he's certain he saw Mrs. Larkin talking to the driver." Miss Marple set down her cup. "Was the driver the same man who has been seen on the old mill road?" "Matches the description exactly," Graves replied. "But when we went to check the building, it was empty. Whoever was there has moved on." They spoke for some minutes more, exchanging observations. When the inspector left, Miss Marple remained seated, her gaze resting on the fire. The pieces were nearly all there now. Mrs. Larkin's urgency, Evelyn's half-glimpsed scene during the interval, Roger Felton's evasions, and the stranger's comings and goings by way of the old mill road. It was a pattern of meetings, planned, deliberate, and carried out under the cover of small, unremarkable errands. The man in the trunk had not stumbled into the village by accident. He had been drawn here, and once here, had been dealt with swiftly. The silver curtain, grand and shimmering, had been the perfect distraction. As dusk fell, Miss Marple rose and crossed to the window. The street lamps were flickering on, and beyond them the shadows lengthened over the green. Somewhere in one of those darkened houses was the person who had set all this in motion. Soon, very soon, she thought, the moment would come when they revealed themselves, if not to the village, then to her. And when that happened, the scandal behind the silver curtain would no longer be a matter of whispered speculation, but a truth that could not be hidden. The next morning dawned sharp and cold, the kind of early spring day when the air carried the tang of frost, though the sun shone weakly through a gauze of high cloud. St. Mary Mead looked as though it had been scrubbed clean overnight. The puddles in the lanes reflected the pale sky, and the hedgerows were beaded with droplets that glinted faintly when the light touched them. To an unknowing visitor, the village might have seemed at peace, untouched by anything more troubling than a late delivery of milk. Miss Marple, however, knew better. Beneath the calm surface, the threads of the case were drawing tighter. The glances exchanged in the high street had grown quicker, the conversations shorter, and the tone of them more guarded. It was the sort of atmosphere that preceded an ending, though whether that ending would bring clarity or further disturbance remained to be seen. She was at her breakfast table, reading the Morning Post, when a knock came at the door. Inspector Graves stood on the step, his expression composed but purposeful. "I think we may be nearing the point where things will break open," he said once she had ushered him inside. "I've reason to believe there was another meeting between Mrs. Larkin and our unidentified man last night. This time not on the old mill road, but in the churchyard itself." Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. "That is bold, but sometimes, the greater the risk, the more urgent the business." Graves nodded. A verger locking up after evening prayers spotted them speaking near the yew trees. He didn't hear much, but he thought he caught the words, "It's too late now," from Mrs. Larkin, and the man replying, "Not if you do as I say." "Which suggests," Miss Marple said gently, "that their arrangement is far from concluded, and that whatever it is under strain." Graves agreed, adding that he intended to keep watch on both Mrs. Larkin and Evelyn Mayhew over the coming days. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the village, stopping here and there to exchange a few words with acquaintances. The air was brisk, carrying with it the distant scent of smoke from someone's chimney. When she reached the green, she found Mrs. Chisel speaking animatedly with Mrs. Price Ridley. The latter, upon seeing Miss Marple, broke into a satisfied smile. "Have you heard the latest? Evelyn Mayhew has been seen at the station, buying a ticket to London, no less. Says she's going to visit a friend. But one wonders why now, in the middle of all this." Miss Marple merely inclined her head, but inside her mind the pattern sharpened. Evelyn's departure, whether genuine or feigned, could be a way of avoiding further questioning or of delivering something into the hands of someone waiting elsewhere. She continued on to the churchyard, ostensibly to admire the daffodils planted along the wall, but really to look more closely at the area where the verger had seen the late-night meeting. The ground beneath the yews was still damp from the rain, and she could see the faint marks of 2 pairs of shoes, one smaller, the impressions neat and close together, the other larger, spaced more widely apart. The prints led away toward the side gate, which opened onto the narrow lane that connected to the main road. From there, it would be simple to reach the station, or to meet someone waiting in a car. In the early evening, as the sun dipped low and the shadows lengthened, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. It was Roger Felton, looking pale and tense. He asked if he might speak with her privately. "I don't know if this will help you or the inspector," he began, "but I think I've been a fool to keep it to myself. On the night of the play, during the interval, I went outside for some air. I saw Mrs. Larkin near the side entrance, speaking to a man I didn't recognize. She handed him something small. I couldn't see what. But when she turned, she spotted me. She told me very firmly that if anyone asked, I hadn't seen her there at all, and like a coward, I agreed." Miss Marple listened without interruption, noting not just his words but the relief that came with speaking them aloud. When he left, she sat for a long time in her parlor, piecing together the final stretches of her mental tapestry. The play, the interval, the silver curtain, it had all been the stage for a meeting. Charles Denning had come to St. Mary Mead expecting to receive something, perhaps a payment, perhaps a message, perhaps a threat made good. But he had also brought with him a danger to those he met, and at least one of them had decided the safest way to deal with him was to ensure he never left the village alive. As night fell, Miss Marple looked out at the quiet lane. The time for quiet observation was drawing to a close. Soon the moment would come when all the small, seemingly unconnected details would be laid out together, and when they were, the truth behind the scandal and the silver curtain would stand revealed, impossible for anyone to deny. The following morning broke clear and still, as though the wind and rain of previous days had exhausted themselves and left the village in a brief moment of calm. To Miss Marple, such pauses were not without meaning. They often came just before the last act in any drama, when the players, knowingly or not, prepared themselves for what must be faced. She had risen early, taken her tea, and arranged her small parlour with the same quiet precision she applied to her knitting patterns. By mid-morning she had sent out 2 brief notes, one to Mrs. Larkin and one to Evelyn Mayhew, inviting them for tea at 4 o'clock. She added a verbal invitation, relayed via Mrs. Chiswell for Roger Felton to pop in for a word at the same time. Inspector Graves, when he arrived just after 3, found her setting out the cups and plates. He raised an eyebrow when she told him who was expected. "Are you quite certain they'll all come?" he asked. "Oh, I think so," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Curiosity is a most reliable lure." By 4, the small parlour was filled with the scent of freshly baked scones and the gentle clink of china. Mrs. Larkin arrived first, her expression carefully composed, followed shortly by Evelyn, who seemed reluctant but resigned. Roger Felton entered last, glancing between the 2 women before taking a seat. Miss Marple poured tea for them all, speaking first of entirely neutral matters. The weather, the improvement of the roses in the church garden, and the vicar's latest sermon, until the air of polite constraint had begun to settle into something almost comfortable. Then, without altering her tone, she said, "I've been thinking a great deal about the night of the play, particularly about the interval." Mrs. Larkin's hand tightened on her teacup. Evelyn's gaze dropped to her lap. Roger shifted uneasily in his chair. "It seems to me," Miss Marple continued, "that the interval was used by more than one person for purposes other than a breath of fresh air. Certain individuals had meetings, private ones with a man who called himself Charles Denning." No one spoke. The ticking of the mantel clock was very loud in the pause. "You see," Miss Marple went on, "Denning's presence in St. Mary Mead was not chance. He came expecting to receive something, perhaps money, perhaps a document, that he felt was owed to him. And at least one person here knew that what he carried with him, in knowledge if not in his pockets, was dangerous. Dangerous enough to wish him gone." Mrs. Larkin's voice was sharp, though controlled. "Are you accusing me of something, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple's eyes met hers without hostility, but without wavering. "Not accusing, my dear. Merely pointing out that certain facts fit together in a way that cannot be ignored. The registered letter you sent to London, the note found in the hedgerow with your monogram, your early morning journeys to Much Benham, all these suggest a connection you have been at pains to conceal." Evelyn stirred uncomfortably, but Miss Marple did not turn to her yet. Instead, she looked to Roger Felton. "And you, Mr. Felton, saw Mrs. Larkin during the interval, did you not? With a man you did not recognize?" Roger hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. "Yes, I told you yesterday," but I didn't see what she gave him. Miss Marple inclined her head. "No, perhaps not. But Evelyn did. Or rather, she saw enough to know it was something of importance. Which brings us to why she has been so very anxious these past days." Evelyn's cheeks flushed. I wasn't sure what I saw. I only know it looked serious." She was handing him something small, wrapped like a packet, and they both seemed tense. Mrs. Larkin set her cup down with care. "This is absurd. I had no reason to—" "On the contrary," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "You had every reason. Denning knew something from your past, something that could ruin you if it became known. He meant to use that knowledge. That, I think, is why you met him in secret before the play and again during the interval. And when you realized that what he demanded could not be given, or that he would never be satisfied, you chose a more permanent solution." Inspector Graves shifted slightly, but Miss Marple's gaze remained steady on Mrs. Larkin. It was during that second meeting, behind the silver curtain, that matters came to a head. The trunk for the stage was nearby, ready for the final act. An opportunity presented itself, and was taken. The room was silent except for the faint sound of the wind outside. Mrs. Larkin's lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. Evelyn's eyes were fixed on her teacup, and Roger looked from one to the other as though seeing them both anew. Miss Marple leaned back slightly in her chair. "I do not think this was done in haste. The meetings, the secrecy, the movements to and from the old mill road all point to a plan. And plans, once begun, have a way of reaching their conclusion, whether we wish them to or not." The clock on the mantel struck the quarter hour, its chimes falling into the quiet like the last notes of a play before the final curtain. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "We are very near that conclusion now. The truth will not remain hidden much longer." No one in the room moved. The stage, Miss Marple knew, was set for the final act. The silence in the small parlor deepened, so that even the faint creak of the wicker chair beneath Miss Marple's slight frame seemed louder than usual. Outside, a branch tapped rhythmically against the window in the breeze. It was Mrs. Larkin who broke the stillness at last, her voice tight. "This is all supposition, Miss Marple. You can't possibly prove any of it." Miss Marple gave a small, almost apologetic smile. "One rarely proves things with blunt force in matters such as these, my dear. One simply lays out the pattern, and the person to whom it belongs will recognize it as their own." She glanced briefly toward Inspector Graves, then folded her hands on her lap. "It begins some years ago, I think, when you knew Charles Denning under another name. Perhaps you thought the matter, whatever it was, safely behind you, but such things have a way of resurfacing when least expected. Denning found himself in difficulty and saw in you a means of securing funds. He made contact, quietly, perhaps by letter first, and arranged to meet in St. Mary Mead. You were to hand him something, money, documents, or both. But you had no intention of letting him walk away free to threaten you again." Mrs. Larkin's lips pressed into a thin line, but she did not speak. Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle, as though relating a story already known. "Your first meeting was not during the play, but earlier, by the old mill road. It was safe there, or so you thought, away from curious eyes. You gave him something to keep him agreeable until the second meeting could take place, the interval of the performance. That interval was ideal. Most people either in the hall chatting or outside in the fresh air. Few would notice you slipping behind the silver curtain, where the trunk for the final scene already stood. Evelyn Mayhew saw you, though she did not understand fully what she was seeing. She thought it was an exchange. Perhaps money, perhaps a letter. Roger Felton also glimpsed you and the man together, though you persuaded him to forget what he'd seen. And the stranger in the black saloon, who has been in and out of our village since, was your go-between, helping to arrange these meetings and perhaps hoping to profit from them himself. Miss Marple paused to pour herself a little more tea, as though they were discussing nothing more weighty than the Women's Institute flower competition. It was in that second meeting that you realized Denning would not be placated. Whatever you gave him, it was not enough. He meant to stay, to push further, to put you in a position from which you could not escape. And so you acted. The means was simple. The trunk was there, already a prop for the play. You struck quickly, perhaps with a stage weight or something else close to hand, and placed him inside. The silver curtain hid you from view while you secured the lid. Later, during the scene, the audience believed they were seeing a theatrical reveal. In truth, they were witnessing the end of a very real and tragic business. Mrs. Larkin's gloved hands were still and tight in her lap. Her eyes had the distant look of someone who is calculating the measure of her position. Evelyn sat motionless, her color high, while Roger shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Inspector Graves broke the pause. "And the letter we found, the one with your monogram?" Miss Marple turned to him. "I believe it was a note meant for the stranger, the man in the black saloon. It may have been meant to arrange a meeting after the fact, perhaps to ensure his silence, perhaps to seek his help in disposing of something connected to the crime. It was never delivered, but it confirms the link between them." Roger spoke suddenly. "Why didn't you just tell him to go? Why—" He stopped himself, realizing the futility of the question. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice held quiet conviction. "Because, my dear, fear and desperation make poor counselors. Mrs. Larkin had built a life here that could not survive the sort of scandal Denning threatened to bring. She chose to protect that life in the quickest way she saw, though in doing so, she destroyed it entirely." Mrs. Larkin gave a short, brittle laugh, without mirth. "You make it sound inevitable." "Inevitable only once the path was chosen," Miss Marple said quietly. "There is always another way, though we seldom see it when panic blinds us." The ticking of the mantel clock filled the room again. Graves rose slowly from his chair, his gaze fixed on Mrs. Larkin. "I think we'll go now, madam." She rose too, with composure enough to smooth her skirt before facing him. "I suppose," she said, "that there's no use denying it any longer." As the inspector led her from the room, the door closing softly behind them, Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Outside, the village sounds carried on as they always had. The clip of hooves on the road, the call of a shop bell, unmoved by the scandal that had unfolded behind one quiet parlor door. The silver curtain had fallen, but the play, Miss Marple knew, was never truly over. Not in the hearts and minds of those left behind.